Okay, so welcome to section 2 of the video section of the Industrial Technology Multimedia syllabus. I am going to talk about video editing in this section of the video. We talked last lesson about importing and exporting, and we're going to be moving on now to what video transitions are. So if you consider that videos are a collection of still images that are played back and forth, you usually have a whole lot of images that are very similar because they come from the same moment in time when they were captured. But we often cut and edit between single moments of footage, and that's what's called a transition. A transition is a technique used in the post-production process. So after you filmed, when you're editing together, when you combine different pieces of footage together. It's effectively the process of changing one to the other. Now we can have things go straight up against each other, and that's fine in editing, or we can have them fade from one to the other, but we really call it a cut. And that's where you join two shots together. So there aren't many films that have a single shot from start to finish. There was a film called Birdman a few years ago that supposedly was shot in one shot. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't, who knows. That would be really difficult to film a 1.5-hour movie in one take, but I digress. It's irrelevant and unimportant for this. In the most basic transition, you simply butt up one piece of footage against the other piece of footage. So when the timeline runs across, it goes there, that piece ends, and it goes into the other one. So it can shot A abruptly ends and shot B abruptly starts. Now that can be fine. A lot of editing does work that way. You don't always want to have a flashy transition. There's some various rules that you need to know, such as the 180-degree rule, where you can't like cross a line and have someone walking this way and then in the next shot have them walking the other way, because it just looks like they're walking in opposite directions. But usually you can get away with just a straight cut unless you want to make something a little bit more interesting. So I'll go through a few of those other types of cuts now. So an Lcut is where the audio and the video cut at different points. So you can have a character like me right now talking at the screen and cut to a different image. So maybe the shot before was here and then we can shoot to the side, but I can keep talking using that original straight on cut. So there's not some sort of abrupt change in the audio. I could also have audio from a different piece of footage over this footage right now. So I could come in with a take that I took later, cut my audio from this one and have the other one coming in. So originally the way that they had to do that was they had to cut out the actual film. So the audio was on a little bar and the video was on another bar. So they would take the audio from one strip, take the video from the other, and kind of sandwich them together, L shape, L cut. But now it's pretty easy to do that in a computer. So yeah, anyway, a match cut. So a match cut is two similarly shaped objects in similar positions of the frame. So a perfect example of that is in 2001: A Space Odyssey. The monkey throws a bone up into the air, which spins, and then we see a match cut to a spaceship floating in space. So they're kind of similar in size, and the idea is that humans' progress has changed some such garbage. But that's a match cut. An invisible cut is another one, and that's where you try to join two shots with similar frames together. It completely hides the transition from the audience, and it's actually quite hard to do. So oftentimes you can tell that a cut's happened, but you have a hard time of showing the exact moment. So an example of that could be if I was to walk into the camera now and get really close to the point where it faded to, let's say, black as all the light of my shirt, cut out the light of the camera, and then we walked away, but I'm facing the other direction now. So a cut's happened, and we know that because it's very obvious that I can't walk and then turn around, but it's a hard time of saying exactly when it happened. We got a jump cut. So jump cuts kind of suck. A jump cut is where it's jarring. So an example of that, it's usually a continuity error, not a choice, but it's where you make some sort of weird cut and all of a sudden I tried to do a jump cut there, and we'll see what happens, whether I can actually be bothered to edit it in. If I haven't, it's going to look really weird, like it just stopped suddenly. But if I did do it, you would notice that kind of amateurish, jumpy look to it, and a lot of your films will have that when you're starting out, just because you don't take enough footage. Another one is a wipe. So a wipe is where it goes across the screen from one to the other. It's usually one of those like iMovie presets that people put in. Star Wars is notorious for star wipes. They just put them in all the time. I don't know. It's usually best not to have flashy transitions, because the whole point of editing is that as a successful editor, you shouldn't be able to see the edits. If you can see the edits and the cuts are jarring, there needs to be a reason for it. So if you can come up with a stylistic or thematic reason for seeing the edits, then that's great, but otherwise it shouldn't happen, okay? So you could use a morph, I guess, where you go from one scene into the other, and I don't know, nobody uses these things. And if you do, it looks tacky. Try and keep editing as simple as possible, because a good editor is to service the story, not to add in things themselves. Let's move on to special effects. So the special effects in the syllabus are kind of strange. I'll go over them just because I kind of have to. So twisting, I don't even know what that is. I assume it's where you alter the way that the screen is in some way. So, you know, you kind of like morph it a little bit to twist it around, but I haven't really seen many films using that. Maybe in some sort of like dream sequence thing where it kind of warps in and out. That sort of thing might be something that we want to talk about. Zooming is really important. Zooming is where you change the camera's lens focus to go closer to something, or you can zoom out to go further away. So we can zoom to show emphasis on stuff. We can zoom to add stylistic effect to something. But usually we want to zoom and focus on something that was smaller before or bigger, or zoom out to make something seem insignificant or show more of the scene. Rotating is literally when the camera rotates. So it can make something disorientating. So if something, you know, slowly starts to shift in this direction, it can confuse the audience, make them feel a little bit strange. Now these of course are mostly practical effects done in camera. We move later on to CGI effects and things like that, and we don't really need to cover them at this point in time. But let's move on to the next effect in the syllabus, which is slow motion. So slow motion is achieved kind of counterintuitively to what you think. You get slow motion. Well, the best way to get slow motion is actually by shooting with an extremely fast frame rate. So if we shoot at, say, 60 frames per second and we want to play it back at 24, it's going to lengthen the length of footage we have by about double. Because what we're doing is we're playing 60 frames per second footage back at 24 frames per second. So in every second of footage is 24 frames per second, which is from 60, half a second. So it kind of stretches it all out. So if you've ever seen one of those really slow-mo videos on YouTube, I think there's some ones where they like crush stuff between pneumatic drills, or they shoot something at like 60,000 frames per second, then you can see slow motion from that, but it only happens by changing the playback frame rate of it. So when we move it from 60,000 frames per second back to, let's say, 60 frames per second or 24 or whatever it is that we've got the video set at, then what happens is it really stretches that time out. So that's how slow motion works. If you've only shot at, say, 24 frames per second and you want to slow it down in slow-mo, what you'll get is you'll start getting jerky pictures that'll last on screen for a longer amount of time, and you'll lose that illusion of movement. So you really have to know ahead of time. So that process is called overcranking, and that comes from the idea that when you would like actually crank the camera to make it go at a certain speed. So if you overcranked it, you're making it crank faster, and you get slow-mo from that. Another way that we can add slow-mo though is through time stretching. So time stretching is where you add copies of frames in. So if you had something at 20 frames per second that you filmed at and you want to double the time in through time stretching, you would simply play each frame twice. And like I said before, that's going to add in that sort of slowed down, unrealistic movement to your scene if you do it too much. So you want to try and avoid that if you can, because you're fabricating extra footage and it's never going to look as good as if you just filmed it properly in the first place. Okay, now the opposite of slow motion is time lapse, and that's where we make something look like it's going really fast when it's going slow. So how do we do that? We film at a really low frame rate. So if we film at 6 frames per second, it's going to play back in a quarter of the time when we play it at 24 frames per second. So you would get 4 seconds of footage in every second of playback. So if you took 1 frame an hour, then a day would pass in 1 second at 24 frames per second. So 1 FPH, I don't know if frame per hour is even a thing, but 1 frame per hour played at 24 frames per second means that that whole day will pass in 1 second. So what you can do then is you can get, if you had a camera outside shooting at 1 frame per hour over the course of a year, you could see the seasons passing pretty quickly. You would have an entire year pass in roughly 6 minutes, that sort of thing, okay? So remember, to get something to move slow, you shoot fast. To get something to move fast on screen, you shoot slow. It's just opposites. The final thing that I want to talk about today is, when I'm talking about effects, is I want to talk about Chroma Key. Now, Chroma Key doesn't seem to be in this section of the syllabus, but it definitely needs to be because it's a huge effect at this point in time. Before I do it, distorting. Distorting is very similar to twisting, and it's just ruining what the footage that's on screen. You're fine. Don't worry about it. All right. Chroma Key is when we pick a color and we choose to make that color invisible. So at the moment, I've shot this entire series of videos on a green screen. So I pick the green color on the wall here, and I choose to make that invisible. So Chroma Key is also known as keying or key light. The After Effects plugin that comes as standard is called key light. And when I make that green color invisible, I can then put any image behind it or any other piece of footage behind it, and then my character, I could be on the moon, or I could be under the water, I could be any number of things, alright? So why is this useful? It allows us to create amazing effects and put our characters into crazy situations without actually having to build a set practically. Now we can see that in tons of superhero movies where they'll be set, let's say, in space, but at the same time we can see that with a city block that's exploding and it's all falling down and everything. So I don't know, like the Avengers movies, they didn't actually destroy a cityscape in any of the battles. They destroyed a CGI cityscape and then they green screened or chroma keyed the live action characters into that. So chroma keying is an effect that has really taken over a lot in a lot of films, for better or for worse. But we're seeing a bit of a backlash and moving towards practical effects again, at least at this point in time, just for the realism and the immersion that that can offer, because at the end of the day, it's easy to make a space scene and green screen someone into it. It's hard to get a convincing performance from an actor. So for example, if I'm looking at a green stick that is supposed to be the Incredible Hulk, it's hard for me as a person to act convincingly towards that stick and then put the character in afterwards. There are ways around that, but you know, sometimes it's better to use green screen and chroma keying, other times it's better to use practical effects, and sometimes it's really good to do a combination of both. Okay, so let's move on to synchronizing sound. So one of the hardest things, well, one of the worst things about watching a film or playback of a video is when the sound starts to drift off the characters on screen. So when you start seeing mouths move out of sync with the audio, or audio is a little bit too early or a little bit too late, it can just really ruin the watching experience. So what you want to do is if you can, it's nice to record your sound and your video on the same device, but a lot of the time the trade-off for that will be quality. So most cameras have really bad audio built in, really bad microphones built in, so you want to consider recording your visuals separately to your sound. So to do that, you then need to sync them over in the editing process. It can be really hard to do that, and that's where we get things like clapper boards, or you can clap on screen. You get a short, sharp sound that's also visually presented on screen. So with the clapper boards, the famous old ones, it's like action and then it claps. Some of them have a digital time code on them as well. What you can do then is you can line up the audio to the clap sound, and because it's such a short, sharp clap that only goes for a fraction of a millisecond, probably for a millisecond, then you can go and connect them together to synchronize it. That would be the way that I would recommend synchronizing it. That would be the way that I would talk about it in the test if you get asked a question about it as well. Okay, moving on to filters. So a filter over color balance in video, you can add an analog filter on the front of an actual video camera to do your color balance, but you can also color grade in digital editing, and that's where you put a series of filters that emphasize or de-emphasize certain hue values. We talked about hexadecimal colors and things of that nature, but you've got a red, green, and a blue value usually, and an alpha value as well, which is the brightness and stuff, and you can change the sensitivity of those various channels of color, make some brighter, some less important, and it can really help to balance the color. So this can be really important as well when you're going across different scenes that are shot at different places and different times, or if you're shooting in the same scene and the sun's gone down a little bit. So if you start shooting at say 5 p.m. and then halfway through the sun starts to set a little bit, you could color grade or use a filter to kind of bring the lightness down in the first half of the scene so it's mostly dark, or you could change the brightness up in the darker portion, but changing the darker portion, the brightness up, could add things like grain noise, so you kind of want to try and avoid that if possible. Filtering it to make it darker could also make it a little bit dull. So maybe you want to color grade both of them slightly, so you make the lighter scene a little bit darker, the darker scene a little bit lighter, happy medium, so you can do as little filtering as possible. But filtering is really just changing emphasis of color with color balance. A brightness filter obviously adds brightness or takes away brightness, so it'll make something lighter or darker, and that'll be fine. Contrast is how black the blacks are and how white the whites are, for want of better explanation. So the higher contrast something is, the blacker the blacks, the whiter the whites, and the more crisp an image will look. But you can also lower the contrast to kind of dull it out a little bit if you want kind of a gloomier, grayer look. Really high contrast can look stylistically almost comic bookish, but if you add too much contrast to it, it can be problematic. Lower contrast can also be cool for certain things, but once again, you've got to be careful with that as well. The next one that we've got in the syllabus is blurring. So you can actually do filters that blur certain parts. So you can choose to do like a box blur, a radial blur. So radial blur, circle, box blur is in a box. Motion blur, where you can set things up to blur if they move at a certain point. So we create a blur circle and a radial blur. There's a point in the center and it blurs out from there. Essentially, we focus on something to make it clear. We can blur something out on purpose to make it not important in a scene. That's, we can think of focus as a good thing and out of focus as bad, but out of focus is not always bad, because if something is out of focus and something is in focus on screen, we will gravitate towards what's in focus. So if something is really important, then you should make sure that it's in focus on screen. If you want to obscure the importance of something, you could blur it out and then have it focus in, so coming from being all fuzzy to quite sharp, and that can be a fun stylistic choice as well. Finally, morphing in video, for some reason that's put on as a filter again. They really love talking about weird effects that nobody uses. So morphing is where it's a special effect in motion pictures where one shape transforms into another shape, okay? So as an example, in my textbook, I've got here a picture of George Bush switching into Arnold Schwarzenegger. That's a morph, okay? Now, when would you use that? I don't honestly know, but it's in the syllabus, and now you know. It's where one thing changes into another one. Okay, so we've talked about video now. Next lesson, we're going to start talking about animation, and there is a little bit of crossover between the two, so feel free to take these two video lessons and the animation lesson as one. Okay, thank you very much.